I'm just going to kick things off with the question. There are points of contact, points of comparison. I don't need to strain for any comparisons, but there's some common subjects that I'd love to hear you talk about. I want to start, Mary, by asking you about a work of yours that isn't in the show, but you were talking about it yesterday, and you were looking at a comparison with Richard's work, and you've also worked with earth, like Richard, in your black earth tile pieces from 1978. You describe them, they map the earth from which they come, and you say that they dematerialize the earth. So how do they do that?
Visually, just visually. After I make these flat, I think of them as earth paintings. So picture they're flat, bumpy, molded off the earth, and then I paint them and glaze them black, and when the light hits them, they dematerialize visually, as like when the moon hits the water. But that was part of my interest.
So you make experiences and you make things. In the show here, three-dimensional shaped paintings, not freestanding objects here, but light boxes. And the paintings themselves really play between their object status and their insubstantiality and the effect that they have. And yet you call yourself and you're defined as a painter. So what does it mean to you, this term painting? How does it encompass your work?
Well, painting to me is an expression that can touch realms of our human state, of our human being, that other things can't. And for me, one of the advantages, why I call it a painting too, is two-dimensional. It's that flatness. For example, like when you have sculpture, which is three-dimensional, you have more. So I'm trying to go for less. With 2 dimensions, you have less. You have one less dimension. And the painting, one important thing to me about painting is that it's flat. It doesn't matter that it's made out of paint. That's why I call my light pieces light paintings. It's more about that they're flat and what they work with, the space and the form. Or I call the earth ones earth paintings. So it's not about the paint, it's about the flatness, possibility of abstraction, things like that.
Right. Richard, while we're on definitions, I could ask you why you're a sculptor, or I could ask you to talk about your show. You said you wanted to do that, so...
I hate definitions. I just call myself an artist.
So tell us something about the show.
Okay. Originally, I'd planned to show more recent works, but it's a curated show, and I think for the better, because I've got a very simple show here, which I really like. Let's talk about the circle in the Amazon first. So, since my first circle in '66, I've been making circles in different landscapes all around the world. Mostly, like circle in Alaska, or circle in Africa, circle in the Antarctic. Mostly in big empty spaces. But I always had a feeling that I should one day make a circle in a rainforest. So. Then a couple of years ago, my good friend Not Vital, a Swiss artist, he was doing one of his projects quite near Manaus, so he invited us to spend some time with him in the jungle. So that's how the circle in the Amazon came about. It was fantastic, really. So I cut the leaves with a machete, and they were really heavy. We had to drag them through the forest. They're really long. And then a couple of, 1 hour after making the circle, they were already beginning to disintegrate in the heat. So the actual circle didn't last long. So the other works in the show are the 2 text works, which are, I like the idea of measuring cosmic events just by the simple human act of walking between a moonrise to a sunrise. Then the other smaller text work sort of illustrates the idea that the moon and the sun, in their orbits, in their time, in their paths across the sky, they're completely independent from each other. So again, I've illustrated that just by what you see in the text work.
Some of your text works are more extensive, more narrative, more like poems or songs. These ones seem to be very lapidary. They're more like it. They have a bit of extension, a bit of narrative, a bit more content. These seem incredibly lapidary and clear. They seem like sculptures.
I wouldn't. Yeah, I mean, they're just they are. What they are. Yeah.
I want to
and
ask,
then I suppose that the mud work. That is, I was thinking about that. It's also made by two circles, two intersecting circles. So that's called gravity crescent. So I often say I make the top half and nature does the rest.
can I ask you both, actually, Richard, start with you, since you were talking about this work, about gesture, because you're both very ambitious artists, you're both also very modest individuals, and ego plays very little part in your work. Your personalities are really kind of embedded in the objectivity of your work, but gesture is really important. So can you say something about how you reconcile the matter-of-factness of the material that you use with the personal energy of the gesture? I mean,
I think that's the heart of my work. All my work, whether it's the walking or the cutting the leaves in the jungle, it's everything is done with my energy. You might call it a gesture, but it's all physical. Like putting the flints out here. It's
So
it's
something is a gesture as well.
Something I love to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary, can I ask you the same question? Because your work is minimal, it's very pure, it's at one level very simple, but you've introduced this element through your own gestural mark making, through the different surfaces. Yeah.
Well, I came back to that early on. I started with white painting shaped, and then I did this series of smaller formed ones where I was sanding out the brushstroke. I didn't want any artist line, I didn't want any subjectivity, I was looking for an objective truth. So I sanded it out, which led me to where I could do the light piece and work with plexiglass, etc. But then there became some stuff that made me realize this, especially when I was introduced to the quantum physics, how important, how essential our perception is to our reality. Our perception really creates our reality. So after having sanded out the brushstroke, wanting to get rid of all subjectivity, ego, etc., I desperately wanted to put some brushstroke back. How much has been a question. How subjective is the universe? How objective? But that's when I wanted to add perception into the painting. So I wanted the painting to have a reality that relates to us, I guess. And so that's a brushstroke to me is the subjective mark bringing in the perceptual reality.
And you talk about physics. You've both been influenced by the natural world. Richard through the landscape, particularly the scene environment. You more through physics. Can you say something a little bit more about that and about how it seemed to be a very key moment in your work?
People think I've studied a lot of physics or something. Not so. I've always read maybe theoretical physics. But what happened is when I was building those light boxes and wanted to get the parts to build the bigger one, I had to take a test before they would sell them to me. So that's when I was introduced. So it wasn't that much. It was really just for the work. I had to take enough physics to get the parts. But to me, theoretical physics questions the state of the human being and where are we with one side of our brain, whereas the artist questions those realities and puts them in the painting with the other side of the brain. And I'm always curious if we could come from both sides of the brain. So I've looked into theoretical physics. They have ideas, they explain a lot, they bring in element, and, it started with the quantum thing, and, they bring in the elements of reality, so that's...
Well, I've always been interested in scale.
In what?
Scale. So some of
Scale.
Scale.
Yeah.
I think it's should be the concern of artists about how they not only use the physical world of the landscape, but the the world of the micro scale of quantum mechanics. So occasionally, sometimes I've made walks which are sort of metaphors for events that happen in at the quantum scale. So like one of the things I said is that my stones are like grains of sand in the landscape, but they're also they can be like atoms, and moving like how things move from one place to another. So in a way, physics is all about matter, movement, time, which is also the subject of my work.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
You have that sense in your work also, that it could be looking
I
at
think
the universe.
one thing we might both be interested in is sort of inner, sort of primal, like his walking, and and physics for me does talk about those things. Perception, ambiguity, describes where we are. It's like, oh my God.
With that in mind, can you tell us a little more simply about the work that you've brought to this exhibition and how you conceived the different spaces? Because each room has a very different quality.
Yes, it has different paintings in each room. These are the paintings I'm working on, and my newest paintings. I wanted to do the show with them. I don't know how to answer that exactly.
The light I find fascinating in the exhibition. And first of all, there's the generated light from the light box, which is a magical experience. And then there are the two front rooms that have mediated daylight, as well as some artificial light. And then there's the room where you've chosen to keep a blackout so that it's all artificial. And I think it's brilliant to have that variety, because the works work in a similar way, but you have a different way of engaging with them.
Exactly. It's the same type of surface, but it shows you the different light, the different time of day affects it. It's the idea for me that the art is in the perception. It's not really on the wall. So that's why a painting in one place looks one way 1 minute. You perceive it from your position, your point of view. And then another time it's different. So in this show, we're able to see all those differences, which I like. And also then we thought, well, the roots of this, or the opposite of where I left off, was in that early piece.
The light box.
In the light box. I actually did those in the 60s. So we thought with the bands to show that this much later, there's still a relation to way back then.
Everything is in the perception. Richard, is that something that
what else
matters
is that?
to you as well? But your works here too, they have this incredible strong materiality, and yet they're also
what you
records
see in
of
my
a
work
moment.
is how I live my life, and how I engage with the world that I was born into and we all live in.
So may I open? Are there questions from the floor? Anybody would like to ask?
Are the flints now?
Sorry.
Are the flints now?
The flints, yes.
They are now.
It's an easy question.
I actually didn't hear it. Are they?
Now.
Nah.
It's a technical question for.
Right. How are they now, Richard?
I think they're just split in two, slightly. Basically, flint is bubbles, igneous bubbles that come up through chalk. So you never get flint on its own. It's always in chalk deposits.
Mm-hmm.
I just like flint because I like the way it looks, not for any geological reasons.
Right.
But also, there's also the point that it was the material of early man. So it has a human dimension.
Yeah.
The stone is as if it's been chipped,
Yeah.
and so it's like a fresh
break in the stone,
Right.
as opposed to the calcified part.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't come out of the ground like that, does it?
Well,
Or it's a bigger piece. That gets
yeah. I think that's what napped means.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Richard, can I just ask you about your use of the sun and the moon?
Yeah.
It's just interesting. You mentioned metaphor earlier, and then I saw the sun and the moon, and I was just thinking about time and age. Would you just say anything about the sun and the moon, basically?
Well, I've said it in this work here.
Yes.
I've made many.
You walk more in the day than you do
Yeah,
at night.
I mean, one of my walks was to walk from Stonehenge, ending on a hilltop in Cornwall at the total eclipse of the sun. So there's many ways that I've used all these cosmic events in my work, just through the medium of walking. For example.
So where did your love of circles come from?
What?
Where did your love of circles? Why? It seems like there's a lot of circles in your work, but there's a lot of straight lines as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
What's it about?
my answer to that is the first time I used a circle, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And so it's proved.
Mary, you experimented
50 years.
with format extensively in your earlier work.
And every circle is different, you know. So that circle in Norway is different from the circle in the Amazon. So it's just the circle is just an abstract idea, really. So the originality of my work is the places I choose to make them in.
So I was going to talk about format.
Pardon?
In your earlier work, you experimented with multiple formats. Now you prefer the rectilinear. You presumably find as much space and as much variety as you want within that rectilinear format.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't hear, you're responding to what he said, I couldn't hear exactly everything he said, darling, but, so what are you saying? Yeah, I
We're talking
use a
about
flat.
format. We're talking about yeah.
I don't really think about format.
It's a given for you.
It comes, it has to be, so I don't really think, I try to get the thought not there. So I don't decide, shall I use this format or that format? It really comes from somewhere else. It just has to be. If I could not do it, fine, but it's those that I just have to do it. So I don't really choose to work with a format.
Any more questions from any of the audience there? No?
I've got a question, but I don't know if Richard, is your step always constant?
Pace. You mean my pace? Yeah.
Like that?
No.
Your step is always like a stride.
I will, like if I'm doing a road walk, I do like 4 miles an hour. And I can almost tell the time after a few hours in the morning. I can look at my watch and I know I'm spot on the button. Because real wilderness walking is different, obviously. Yeah. So
I don't need the microphone, I don't think. I have not really a question, rather an observation, and I think it's probably only for Richard, because Mary is far too young. But I just like to
Thanks very much.
Richard, that old artists never die, they just get better, and I really love your work.
no, thank you very much.
On that note, having
That's very good.
heard the artists
Good time to
and
end.
their youth and they're getting better, it's time to go and see the shows. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts and sharing your work. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.